The rain hammered against the windshield as Marcus Chen sat in the driver's seat of the stolen Honda Civic, watching the mansion through night vision binoculars. Beside him, his partner Jake Sullivan nervously tapped his fingers against the dashboard, creating an irritating rhythm that grated on Marcus's nerves. They had been casing this particular house in the Hollywood Hills for 3 weeks, and tonight was finally the night. The owners were supposed to be in New York for some charity gala, according to the social media posts their inside contact had shown them. The house would be empty, vulnerable, and filled with the kind of valuables that could set them up for years. Marcus had been in the robbery game for almost a decade, ever since his construction business went bankrupt and his wife left him with nothing but debt and broken dreams. He had learned to read houses like books, understanding which ones had serious security and which ones relied on their gated community status for protection. This mansion was a beauty, a sprawling contemporary masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling windows that practically invited them inside. The security system was high-end but predictable, the kind that wealthy people installed and then forgot to update. Jake, despite his nervous energy, was a wizard with electronics and had already mapped out exactly how they would bypass every sensor and camera. They had assembled a crew of 5 for this job. Besides Marcus and Jake, there was Tommy Rodriguez, a former gymnast who could scale walls and slip through spaces that seemed impossible. There was also Derek Walsh, the muscle of the group, a man whose imposing presence had talked them out of trouble more than once. Finally, there was Lisa Chen, Marcus's younger sister, who served as their lookout and getaway driver. She sat 2 blocks away in a van, monitoring police scanners and watching the feed from the drone they had deployed earlier. The drone had confirmed what they already suspected. The house was dark, no movement inside, no cars in the driveway except for what looked like a vintage motorcycle under a tarp in the garage. Marcus checked his watch for the 100th time. Midnight approached, and with it, their window of opportunity. The neighborhood security patrol passed by every 4 to 5 minutes like clockwork, which gave them a comfortable margin to get in, grab what they needed, and disappear into the night. They had identified the most valuable items during their reconnaissance. There was a collection of watches in the master bedroom worth at least $200,000. Original artwork hung on the walls, pieces by artists whose names Marcus couldn't pronounce but whose value he understood perfectly. There was also rumored to be a safe in the home office, though they hadn't been able to confirm its location or contents. The communication device in Marcus's ear crackled to life, and Lisa's voice came through clear and calm. She had always been the steady one in the family, the person who could keep her head when everything went sideways. She confirmed that the patrol had just passed and wouldn't return for another 40 minutes. The coast was clear, the night was theirs, and fortune favored the bold. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, that familiar cocktail of adrenaline and anticipation flooding his system. This was the moment when all the planning either paid off or fell apart, when theory met reality and they discovered whether they were as good as they thought they were. They exited the vehicle quietly, dressed entirely in black, their faces covered with balaclavas that made them look like shadows given human form. Tommy and Derek emerged from their position near the perimeter wall, falling into step behind Marcus and Jake as they approached the property. The wall was 8 feet high, topped with decorative ironwork that was more aesthetic than functional. Tommy went over first, landing silently on the other side and checking for any signs of immediate danger. He gave the all-clear signal, and one by one, they dropped into the property, their feet touching down on perfectly manicured grass that probably cost more to maintain than most people's monthly rent. The house loomed before them, its modern architecture creating strange angles and shadows in the darkness. This was it, Marcus thought, the score that would change everything. They had no idea how right he was, though not in the way any of them expected. Jake knelt beside the security panel near the side entrance, his gloved fingers working with practiced precision as he connected his tablet to the system. The device's screen glowed softly in the darkness, lines of code scrolling past as his custom software probed for weaknesses in the security architecture. Marcus stood guard, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of neighbors or unexpected movement. The wealthy had a habit of being oblivious to their surroundings, cocooned in their privilege and false sense of safety, but Marcus never relied on anyone's ignorance. Survival in this business meant assuming everything could go wrong, and planning accordingly. The lock clicked open with a satisfying sound that sent a surge of confidence through the group. They were inside the perimeter now, past the first layer of protection, and so far everything had gone according to plan. Jake carefully opened the door, wincing at the slight creak of hinges that sounded like a scream in the silent night. They filed inside quickly, pulling the door closed behind them and pausing to let their eyes adjust to the interior darkness. The house smelled expensive, that particular combination of leather, wood polish, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify, perhaps the scent of success itself. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior had promised. The entryway opened into a massive living space with vaulted ceilings and that characteristic Hollywood blend of luxury and carefully curated casualness. Modern furniture arranged in conversation groupings, abstract art on the walls, and enough technology to run a small country. Marcus signaled for the team to split up according to their predetermined plan. Tommy would take the second floor where the master bedroom and its treasure trove of watches awaited. Derek would search the ground floor for easily transportable valuables. Jake would locate and crack the safe. Marcus himself would oversee everything, coordinating their movements and ensuring they stayed on schedule. They moved through the house like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by expensive rugs and their breathing controlled despite the adrenaline pumping through their veins. Marcus found himself in what appeared to be a home theater, complete with plush reclining seats and a screen that covered an entire wall. Movie posters lined the corridor leading away from the theater, and in the dim light from their flashlights, Marcus noticed they were signed originals. He recognized a few titles, blockbusters that had dominated the box office, but he didn't linger to examine them. They were here for portable wealth, items they could move quickly and sell through their established channels. Tommy's voice came through the earpiece, excitement barely contained as he reported finding the watch collection. The pieces were even more spectacular than their intel had suggested, ranging from vintage Rolexes to limited edition Patek Philippe's, each one a small fortune unto itself. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was going to be the score of a lifetime, the one that let him finally retire from this dangerous business and disappear somewhere warm where extradition treaties were more suggestion than law. Maybe Costa Rica, or perhaps one of those small islands in the Pacific where money talked and questions weren't asked. Derek had found a study lined with bookshelves and what appeared to be genuine first editions of classic novels. On the desk sat a laptop, probably password protected but potentially containing information more valuable than anything else in the house. Marcus made a mental note to have Jake grab it before they left. Identity theft wasn't usually their game, but opportunities like this didn't come along often. Jake reported that he had located the safe behind a painting in the home office, a cliché that made Marcus smile despite the tension of the moment. Rich people watched the same movies everyone else did, and apparently thought hiding safe behind artwork was still clever. As Marcus moved deeper into the house, he entered what appeared to be a game room, pool table, vintage arcade machines, and an entire wall dedicated to what looked like memorabilia from various film sets. Something about the collection nagged at him, a pattern he couldn't quite identify. The items seemed connected somehow, all from similar types of movies, action comedies, and superhero films. He was about to dismiss the observation when he noticed a framed photograph on the wall, partially illuminated by his flashlight beam. His blood ran cold as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The photograph showed the owner of the house in full costume, the distinctive red and black suit unmistakable even in the dim light. Marcus's mind raced, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. The motorcycle in the garage, the signed movie posters, the specific type of memorabilia throughout the house. They weren't robbing just another wealthy Hollywood resident. They had broken into the home of Ryan Reynolds, one of the most famous actors on the planet, a man whose face was recognized globally, whose security would be taken seriously by law enforcement in a way that ordinary robberies never were. Marcus grabbed his radio to warn the others, his mind already calculating how quickly they could abort the mission and disappear. But before he could speak, lights blazed throughout the house with blinding intensity, and a voice boomed through hidden speakers, calm and tinged with dark humor that Marcus would have found funny under any other circumstances. The voice said simply, "Guys, I really think we should talk about this." Ryan Reynolds stood at the top of the staircase, wearing sweatpants and a faded Vancouver Canucks t-shirt, looking remarkably relaxed for a man confronting armed intruders in his home. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had just been roused from sleep, but his eyes were alert and calculating, taking in every detail of the scene below him. Marcus felt his hand instinctively move toward the pistol tucked into his waistband, but he stopped himself, his mind racing through the implications of what pulling that weapon would mean. They had crossed from robbery into something far more serious, and every decision from this moment forward would determine whether they saw the outside of prison cell again. The actor descended the stairs with an almost casual grace, his hands visible and empty, no phone in sight to suggest he had called the authorities. Marcus's team had frozen in various positions throughout the visible portions of the house, caught like animals in headlights, their carefully laid plans evaporating in the face of this impossible situation. Tommy appeared at the top of the opposite staircase, the bag of watches dangling from his hand, looking between Reynolds and Marcus with an expression that mixed panic and disbelief. Derek had emerged from the study, his imposing frame somehow seeming smaller in the presence of the homeowner's unexpected calm. Reynolds reached the bottom of the stairs and leaned against the banister with a kind of relaxed posture that suggested this was perhaps not his first encounter with unwanted visitors, though Marcus suspected the circumstances were usually quite different. The actor's voice, when he spoke, carried that same sardonic humor that had made him famous, but underneath it was still an awareness of the danger that kept Marcus's hand away from his weapon. Reynolds suggested they all take a moment to breathe and consider their options, because the situation was not quite what they thought it was, and decisions made in panic tended to have consequences that lasted far longer than anyone wanted. Marcus found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, the adrenaline and shock making his throat tight. He demanded to know why Reynolds wasn't in New York, why the house wasn't empty as their intelligence had indicated. The actor's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy mixed with amusement, and he explained that he had indeed been scheduled to attend a charity event in New York, but he had canceled at the last minute due to what he called a persistent feeling that something was off. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and those instincts had told him to stay home tonight, to keep watch over his family and property. The mention of family sent ice through Marcus's veins. He hadn't seen any signs of other people in the house, no sounds of children or a spouse, but the possibility that they had endangered innocent people beyond just the property owner himself added a layer of moral weight that made his stomach churn. Reynolds seemed to read the question in Marcus's expression and quickly clarified that his family was indeed in New York, safe and far from the situation, but that he had stayed behind specifically because he had suspected something like this might happen. The security company had reported unusual activity in the neighborhood over the past few weeks, patterns that suggested professional surveillance rather than random crime. Jake, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking with the strain of their situation. He asked what Reynolds planned to do, whether the police were already on their way, whether their lives as they knew them were effectively over. The actor tilted his head, considering the question with what seemed like genuine thoughtfulness, and then he said something that stopped everyone's breath. He told them the police were not coming, at least not yet, because he had not called them. The security system that had triggered the lights and speakers was independent of any law enforcement notification, a private system he had installed for exactly this kind of scenario. Marcus's criminal instinct screamed that this was a trap, that Reynolds was buying time until armed response teams surrounded the property, but something in the actor's demeanor suggested otherwise. There was a weariness in his expression, a wild weariness that transcended his privileged position and spoke to some deeper understanding of human nature and circumstance. Reynolds explained that he had been thinking about wealth and privilege a lot lately, about the randomness of success and the desperation that drove people to cross lines they never imagined crossing. He said he saw something in their eyes, especially in Marcus's, that suggested they were not career criminals but rather people who had been pushed to the edge and made terrible choices. The actor proposed something that seemed insane in its generosity and risk. He suggested that instead of calling the police and watching their lives end in arrest and incarceration, they could sit down and talk like human beings. He wanted to understand their stories, wanted to know what had brought them to this moment, breaking into his home and risking everything from material possessions that, in the grand scheme of things, meant nothing compared to freedom and dignity. In exchange for their honest stories, he would let them walk away, no police, no charges, no consequences beyond having to live with the knowledge of what they had almost done. Marcus stared at the famous actor, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives, but found only what appeared to be genuine curiosity mixed with compassion. It was possibly the strangest negotiation he had ever been part of, and he had been in some unusual situations over the years. The kitchen was enormous, all marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that probably cost more than the car Marcus had stolen for tonight's job. Reynolds moved around the space with comfortable familiarity, pulling out chairs around a massive island and gesturing for the crew to sit. He started making coffee, the mundane domestic action so surreal in the context of what had just happened that Marcus almost laughed. Here they were, 5 criminals who had broken into this man's home with the intention of robbing him blind, now sitting around his kitchen island while he prepared beverages like they were guests at some bizarre midnight social gathering. Tommy had reluctantly placed a bag of watches on the counter, the timepieces gleaming under the kitchen's recessed lighting, each one representing more money than he had seen in years of legitimate work before turning to crime. Derek sat with his massive arms crossed, his expression unreadable, clearly struggling with whether to trust his situation or prepare for the inevitable betrayal he had been conditioned to expect from a lifetime of disappointments. Jake had removed his balaclava, revealing a young face marked by acne scars and the premature lines that came from constant stress and poor sleep. Marcus kept his mask on for another moment before Reynolds gently suggested that if they were going to have an honest conversation, anonymity defeated the purpose. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the kitchen with an aroma that reminded Marcus of better times, of Saturday mornings with his ex-wife before everything fell apart, before the economy crashed and took his business with it, before the debt collectors started calling and the threats began. He pulled off his mask, feeling strangely vulnerable without it, his face exposed to a man who could destroy their lives with a single phone call. Reynolds poured coffee into expensive mugs and distributed them, then leaned against the counter with his own cup, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that trust had to be built incrementally, especially in circumstances as bizarre as these. Marcus found himself speaking first, the words tumbling out in a way that surprised him with their honesty and rawness. He'd talk about his construction business, how he had employed 15 people and felt pride in creating something tangible, buildings and homes that would stand for generations. He described the financial crisis that wiped out his contracts, the banks that called in his loans with ruthless efficiency, the divorce that followed as his marriage crumbled under the weight of failure and shame. He explained how he had tried to find legitimate work, but the economy was flooded with desperate men just like him, and age discrimination hit harder than anyone wanted to admit. 52 years old, too young to retire but too old to compete with cheaper, younger workers. Tommy spoke next, his voice soft and filled with regret that seemed to age him beyond his 28 years. He had been a promising athlete, a gymnast who had dreams of Olympic competition, until a badly healed injury destroyed those aspirations. Without the structure of training and competition, he had drifted, falling in with the wrong people, making decisions that seemed small at the time but accumulated into a criminal record that made legitimate employment nearly impossible. He had tried to go straight multiple times, but the combination of his record and lack of practical skills meant he could only find minimum wage work that barely covered rent, let alone allowed him to build any kind of future. Derek's story was perhaps the most heartbreaking in its simplicity and unfairness. He had a daughter with special needs, medical expenses that insurance refused to cover, treatments that could improve her quality of life but that cost more money than he could ever earn through legal means. He had worked 3 jobs simultaneously, destroying his health and missing precious time with his daughter, only to watch the bills pile up faster than he could pay them. The desperation of watching your child suffer when potential solutions exist just out of financial reach had driven him to places he never imagined going, crossing ethical lines he had once considered sacred and inviolable. Jake revealed that he was drowning in student debt from a computer science degree that had promised a lucrative career, but delivered only rejection letters and unpaid internships. He had graduated into a job market that wanted 5 years of experience for entry-level positions, that paid poverty wages while demanding complete devotion and overtime. He had watched his more privileged classmates, those with family connections and financial safety nets, walk into opportunities that remained forever closed to him. The bitterness and resentment had grown until he stopped seeing the value in playing by rules that seemed designed to keep people like him permanently struggling. Reynolds listened to each story without interruption, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, a recognition perhaps of the arbitrary nature of fortune and misfortune. When Lisa's voice crackled through the radio asking for a status update, Marcus explained her situation to the sister who had followed him into crime out of loyalty and love, who had sacrificed her own legitimate career prospects to watch his back. The actor set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard, weighing stories of desperation against the violation of his home and privacy. Finally, Reynolds spoke, his voice stripped of its usual humor, replaced by a thoughtfulness that suggested he was genuinely grappling with complex questions about justice, mercy, and the systems that created situations like this. He acknowledged that their circumstances were difficult, that systemic problems had contributed to their choices, but he also pointed out that other people faced similar hardships without turning to crime. The question was not whether they had suffered, but whether suffering justified harming others, even through property crime that seemed victimless but never truly was. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky beyond the massive windows when Reynolds finally made his proposition, the kind of offer that existed nowhere in legal frameworks or normal human interactions, something born entirely of this strange night and the conversations that had unfolded. He told them he was going to keep his word about not calling the police, but with conditions that went far beyond simply walking away and pretending this night never happened. He wanted to offer them something that no one had apparently offered before, a genuine second chance, but one that came with expectations and accountability that would test whether they were truly ready to change their lives. Reynolds explained that he was part of various charitable organizations and business ventures, some public and some private, that focus on rehabilitation and second chances. He had connections to job training programs, addiction counselors, financial advisors who specialize in helping people dig out of debt, and business owners willing to hire people with troubled pasts if someone they trusted vouched for them. He could open doors that had been slammed in their faces, but only if they were willing to walk through those doors and do the hard work that lasting change required. It would not be easy, and it would not be quick, but it would be real, a path back to the kind of lives they had once imagined for themselves. The catch was that they would be connected to him, accountable to him in a way that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable at first. Reynolds wanted regular updates on their progress, wanted to know they were following through on the opportunities he was providing, wanted proof that his trust was not misplaced. He would become, in a sense, responsible for them, and they for his faith in human nature and redemption. If they violated that trust, if they returned to crime or squandered the chances he was giving them, the consequences would be severe not just for them but for his ability to help others in the future. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes for the first time in years, the weight of shame and gratitude mixing into something almost unbearable. He asked why Reynolds was doing this, why a man who owed them nothing and whom they had actively tried to harm was extending such extraordinary grace. The actor's answer was simple but profound. He said that he had been lucky, blessed with talents and opportunities in the right circumstances at the right times, and that luck came with responsibility. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, more success than any reasonable person could expect, and he believed deeply that those who had been given much had an obligation to give back, especially to those who had been given far less. Tommy asked if this was some kind of publicity stunt, whether cameras were recording this moment for a documentary or social media content, whether their desperation was going to be transformed into entertainment for Reynolds' brand management. The actor's face hardened slightly, and he made clear that this conversation would remain private, that no one would ever know about this night except the people in this room. He was not interested in performing charity for an audience or building his reputation on their suffering and redemption. This was between them, a covenant that depended on mutual trust and silence. Derek brought up his daughter, his voice breaking as he asked whether the help being offered extended to her medical needs, whether there was any possibility of getting her the treatment she desperately required. Reynolds paused, then made a call right there in the kitchen, waking up someone who apparently did not mind being disturbed at dawn by the actor. The conversation was brief but intense, and when Reynolds hung up, he told Derek that he had a friend who ran a foundation focused on rare medical conditions and that they would look into his daughter's case. No promises, but genuine effort to find solutions that insurance companies had denied. Jake wanted to know about his student debt, the crushing burden that colored every decision and made legitimate paths forward seem impossible when half his income would go to loan payments for decades. Reynolds admitted he could not make that debt disappear, but he knew people who specialize in debt negotiation and restructuring who might be able to reduce the burden to something manageable. More importantly, he could connect Jake with tech companies owned by friends who valued talent over credentials and who paid salaries that made debt something that could actually be overcome rather than a permanent sentence. As the sun rose fully, transforming the Hollywood Hills into a landscape of gold and shadow, Marcus made a decision that he knew his crew would follow. They would accept Reynolds' offer, would take the chance being extended with both hands and hold on to it like drowning men grasping a lifeline. They would leave behind the watches, the art, the laptop, everything they had come to steal, and instead take something far more valuable: hope, opportunity, and the belief that their stories were not yet finished being written. Reynolds walked them to the door, returning their tools and equipment, but keeping a photograph he had taken of all of them together. Insurance, he said with a slight smile, a reminder that he knew their faces and could find them if necessary. But the gesture did not feel threatening. Instead, it felt like a teacher documenting a moment of transformation, evidence that change was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Marcus shook the actor's hand, finding himself unable to articulate the gratitude and bewilderment that filled him, settling instead for a simple thank you that carried the weight of everything unsaid. 6 months later, Marcus was managing construction crew again, this time for a company owned by one of Reynolds' business associates, rebuilding homes for low-income families. Tommy was teaching gymnastics to at-risk youth, channeling his skills into inspiration rather than crime. Derek's daughter had received treatment through the foundation and was showing remarkable improvement, her father working security for the same foundation and becoming an advocate for other families facing similar struggles. Jake had landed a position at a tech startup that valued his skills and paid him enough to make real progress on his debt while actually enjoying his work. And Lisa, who had waited in that van expecting the worst and instead witnessed something she still struggled to believe, had enrolled in college to become a social worker, determined to help others find paths away from the desperation that had nearly destroyed her family. They stayed in touch with each other and, occasionally, with Reynolds himself, who checked in not as a supervisor but as someone genuinely interested in their progress and struggles. The actor never spoke publicly about that night, never used their story for his benefit, keeping his word in a world where words often meant nothing. They had entered that house as thieves, desperate people willing to take what was not theirs because they saw no other options. They left as something different, not redeemed yet but on the path toward redemption, carrying the gift of a second chance that they had done nothing to earn but everything to deserve. And sometimes, on sleepless nights, Marcus would think about how close they had come to disaster, how different their lives would be if they had chosen any other house, any other night. But they had chosen Reynolds' house, and Reynolds had chosen mercy, and that choice had changed everything.